Before we begin, a quick note about how this episode was created. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own. Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. Episode 7, Structuralism, Titchener, and the Functionalist Protest. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through the theories, rivalries, contradictions, and questionable academic meeting policies that shaped psychology. Today's drama, structuralism tries to map consciousness. Functionalism walks in and asks, but what does it do? And that question changes everything. In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline. We are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. Last time we saw Ebbinghaus, Brentano, and Culpa push beyond Wundt. Today we follow Wundt's psychology across the Atlantic, where E.B. Titchener transforms it into something different, structuralism. Then we'll see why functionalism emerged as a protest against both Wundt and Titchener. Part 1. Why Wundt was not quite a structuralist. When E.B. Titchener brought Wundt's system of psychology to the United States, he presented himself as a loyal student and follower of Wundt. But he dramatically altered Wundt's system. Titchener called his approach structuralism and claimed it represented Wundt's psychology. But it differed from Wundt's psychology in major ways. So, structuralism was really Titchener's own psychology. This distinction matters. Wundt did identify the elements or contents of consciousness, but he was mostly interested in how those elements were organized. He cared about synthesis. He wanted to understand how mental elements were combined into higher-level cognitive processes through apperception. Remember, Wundt believed the mind had the active power to organize mental elements. Titchener also studied the elements and contents of consciousness, but he emphasized their mechanical linking through association, and he did not accept Wundt's doctrine of apperception. That means Titchener's psychology was more element-focused and less concerned with active mental organization. In short, Wundt emphasized organization and synthesis. Titchener emphasized structure and elements. That difference is the beginning of structuralism. Part 2. Titchener's subject matter. Titchener's work focused on the actual elements of consciousness. For him, the fundamental task of psychology was to discover the nature of elementary conscious experience. He wanted to analyze consciousness into its component parts and determine its structure. That is why the term structuralism makes sense. Structuralism asks, what is consciousness made of? What are its basic elements? How are those elements arranged? What is the structure of conscious experience? According to Titchener, the subject matter of psychology was conscious experience, as that experience depends on the person experiencing it. He believed experience depends on the experiencing individual. This type of conscious experience, in his view, was the only proper focus of psychological research. In his 1909 book, A Textbook of Psychology, Titchener described the difference between independent and dependent experience. Independent experience is experience considered apart from the experiencing person. Dependent experience is experience as it depends on the person having it. Psychology for Titchener studied dependent experience. Titchener also believed structural psychology was a pure science. It should not be concerned with applying psychological knowledge. He did not think psychology's purpose was to cure sick minds, reform society, improve education, or solve practical problems. Its only legitimate purpose was to discover facts about the structure of the mind. Psychologists, according to Titchener, should remain free from speculation about the practical worth of their work. That attitude will become one of the reasons functionalists push back. Part 3. The stimulus error. One of Titchener's most famous ideas was the stimulus error. The stimulus error occurs when an observer confuses the mental process with the object being observed. Let's say an observer looks at a banana. If the observer says, "I see a banana," Titchener would say they have committed the stimulus error. Why? Because they are naming the object instead of reporting the elementary conscious content of the experience. In Titchener's laboratory, the observer should describe the experience in terms of color, brightness, shape, spatial characteristics, and other immediate qualities. So instead of banana, the observer might report yellow, curved, elongated, bright, smooth-edged. The point is that the object is not supposed to be described using everyday language. It should be described in terms of the elementary conscious content of the experience. If an observer focuses on the stimulus object instead of the conscious content, they fail to distinguish what they already know about the object from their immediate experience of it. That means they are interpreting, not observing. They are dealing with mediate experience, not immediate experience. For Titchener, psychology required observers to unlearn ordinary ways of describing the world. That is one reason his method required intense training. Part 4. Titchener's introspection. Titchener's form of introspection relied on observers trained to describe the elements of their conscious state. They were not supposed to report the stimulus by its familiar name. Titchener believed that, in everyday life, people naturally learn to describe experience in terms of objects. That is useful in normal life. If someone asks what you ate for breakfast, banana works better than a curved yellow patch with mild sweetness. But in Titchener's laboratory, everyday naming had to be unlearned. He adopted Culpa's label, systematic experimental introspection. Like Culpa, Titchener used detailed, qualitative, subjective reports of mental activity during introspection. This differed from Wundt's approach. Wundt favored objective, quantitative measurements under controlled conditions. Titchener believed those measurements were not useful for uncovering the elementary sensations and images of consciousness that form the core of his psychology. The two men differed sharply. Titchener was interested in analyzing complex conscious experience into component parts. Wundt was interested in the synthesis of those elements through apperception. Titchener emphasized the parts. Wundt emphasized the whole. Titchener was therefore closer to the British empiricists and associationists because he wanted to discover the atoms of the mind. He wanted his observers to behave almost like impartial, mechanical, detached recording instruments. At the same time, he kept Wundt's idea that trained observation should become so habitual and mechanized that observers would no longer be distracted by the act of observing itself. Part 5. Titchener's 3 Problems of Psychology. Titchener defined 3 essential problems of psychology, modeled on the natural sciences. First, reduce conscious processes to their simplest components. Second, determine the laws by which these elements of consciousness are associated. Third, connect the elements with their physiological conditions. This reflects the broader scientific model of the time. Natural scientists aim to discover the elements of the natural world, show how those elements combine into complex phenomena, and formulate laws governing those phenomena. Titchener wanted psychology to do the same with consciousness. Most of his research focused on the first goal, discovering the elements of consciousness. He identified 3 elementary states of consciousness: sensations, images, and affective states. Let's take those one at a time. Part 6. Sensations, images, and affective states. For Titchener, sensations were the basic elements of perception. They occurred in experiences evoked by physical objects in the environment, such as sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches. Images were the elements of ideas. They appeared in mental processes reflecting experiences that were not actually present at the moment. For example, a memory of a past experience would involve images. Affective states, or affections, were the elements of emotion. They appeared in experiences such as love, hate, sadness, and other emotional states. Titchener believed each element was conscious and distinct from the others. These elements could combine to form perceptions, ideas, and emotions. He treated mental elements as basic and irreducible, much like chemical elements, and just as chemical elements could be grouped into classes, mental elements could also be classified. Despite their simplicity, mental elements had attributes that allowed psychologists to distinguish among them. Part 7. The Attributes of Conscious Elements. Titchener expanded on Wundt's attributes of conscious experience. Wundt had emphasized quality and intensity. Titchener added duration and clearness. So, for Titchener, most sensations had 4 basic attributes: quality, intensity, duration, and clearness. Quality is the characteristic that distinguishes one element from another. For example, cold differs from warm, and red differs from blue. Intensity refers to the strength, weakness, loudness, or brightness of a sensation. Duration refers to the course of a sensation over time. Clearness refers to the role of attention in conscious experience. An experience that is the focus of attention is clearer than one that is not attended to. Sensations and images possess all four of these characteristics. Affective states, however, have only three: quality, intensity, and duration. Titchener believed affective states lack clearness because it is impossible to focus attention directly on an element of feeling or emotion. When we try to focus directly on a feeling, the affective quality changes or disappears. Titchener also believed that sensory processes such as vision and touch have another attribute: extensity, meaning they take up space. For affective states, he accepted only one basic dimension: pleasure, displeasure. That is another way he differed from Wundt, who had proposed a three-dimensional theory of feelings. Part 8. Titchener and Women. A contradictory legacy. Now we need to talk about one of the most contradictory parts of Titchener's legacy. A group of psychologists known as the Titchener experimentalists began meeting regularly to compare research notes. Titchener selected who was invited and controlled the topics discussed. One of his rules was that women were not allowed. He claimed he wanted oral reports to occur in a smoke-filled room where people could interrupt, dissent, and criticize freely, and he considered women too pure to smoke. That reasoning is exactly as absurd as it sounds. Many women attempted to attend the meetings and were ordered to leave. One famous story involves E.G. Boring's fiancée, Lucy May, and another woman hiding under a table in the next room to listen while a meeting was in session. Lucy May Boring later received her PhD from Cornell University in 1912. She once asked Titchener to read a paper based on experimental psychology work she had done in German and Berlin with Müller and Helmholtz at one of his meetings. Titchener refused. Lucy May Boring responded by calling his no women policy immoral and unscientific. Correct. And yet, here's the contradiction. Although Titchener excluded women from his meetings, he also encouraged and supported women's advancement in psychology in other ways. He accepted women into his graduate program at Cornell when many universities, including Harvard and Columbia, rejected them. More than one-third of the 56 doctoral degrees Titchener awarded went to women. More women completed doctoral degrees with Titchener than with any other male psychologist of his era. He also supported hiring women to faculty positions, and once insisted on hiring a female professor, despite objections from the dean. Margaret Floy Washburn, the first woman to earn a doctoral degree in psychology, earned that degree under Titchener. So Titchener's stance on women was deeply contradictory. He kept women out of his elite professional meetings, but he also opened academic doors that many other male psychologists kept firmly closed. That contradiction matters because history is rarely clean. People can advance a field in one way and restrict it in another. That is one reason historical thinking requires nuance. Part 9. Structuralism's contributions. Structuralism made several important contributions, even though it did not last as a dominant school. One major contribution is that it gave later psychologists something to push against. That may sound like a backhanded compliment, but it is genuinely important. Many psychologists opposed Titchener's viewpoint, and that opposition helped them produce new theories, methods, and discoveries. Scientific fields often develop by rejecting earlier systems. Titchener did not conform well to the zeitgeist of the 20th century. His psychology was too pure, too narrow, and too uninterested in application for the direction psychology was taking, especially in the United States. But his system inspired strong responses. New generations did not need his theory or his method in order to study psychology. They built from it, revised it, or rejected it. Structuralism also gave psychology a clear definition of subject matter: conscious experience. Titchener used scientific methods grounded in observation, experimentation, and measurement. And although his specific form of introspection was criticized heavily, introspective methods have not disappeared from psychology. Self-reports, clinical reports, personality tests, questionnaires, and verbal reports all have introspective elements. Today, psychologists may use self-report data to study reasoning, emotion, attitudes, symptoms, personality, memory, and conscious experience. The aim is different from structuralism, but verbal reports based on experience remain legitimate forms of data. So Titchener's system did not survive intact, but parts of its legacy remain. The aim is different from structuralism, but verbal reports based on experience remain legitimate forms of data. So Titchener's system did not survive intact, but parts of its legacy remain. Part 10. Criticisms of Introspection. One of the biggest criticisms of structuralism involved introspection. Critics argued that introspection was subjective. Immanuel Kant had argued that any attempt to observe conscious experience alters the conscious experience being studied. In other words, the act of observing becomes part of the experience. That creates a problem. If I ask you to inspect your own consciousness, your inspection may change what is happening in consciousness. Henry Maudsley also argued that rigorous training could build bias into introspective reports. If observers are trained to report only certain kinds of experiences, then maybe the method produces the results it expects to find. Titchener was accused of modifying introspection so that it would appear to fit the standards of science. The definition of introspection itself was also attacked. Titchener had difficulty defining exactly what he meant by the introspective method, except by tying it to specific experimental conditions. Another criticism involved observer training. Titchener instructed observers to avoid ordinary words that had become fixed in everyday vocabulary but had no scientific meaning. But this created a problem. If observers could not use ordinary language, how were they supposed to record their experiences? They would need a special introspective language, and they would also need to be having identical experiences for their reports to be comparable. But such a language was never fully developed. Observers often disagreed, even under carefully controlled experimental conditions. That made introspection vulnerable as a scientific method. Part 11. More criticisms of structuralism. Critics also argued that introspection was really a form of retrospection. Even if the delay was brief, some time elapsed between the experience and the report of the experience. And Ebbinghaus had already shown that forgetting is most rapid immediately after an experience. So critics argued that some part of the experience might be lost before it could be reported. The delay itself could also change the conscious state produced by the stimulus. Another challenge came from Freud's theory of unconscious mental processes. If Freud was right that much of mental life is unconscious, then introspection cannot access many of the most important aspects of the mind. Structuralism was also criticized as artificial and sterile. Critics argued that conscious experience cannot be meaningfully broken into isolated elements and then reconstructed later by association. They said experience does not come to us as individual sensations, images, and affective states. It comes as organized wholes. This criticism became central to Gestalt psychology, which revolted against structuralism's elementism. Gestalt psychologists argued that the whole is not simply the sum of its parts. So structuralism was criticized for being too narrow, too artificial, too dependent on trained introspection, and too limited in its definition of psychology. Titchener picked and chose which areas of psychology counted based on what fit his system. And critics said that was not enough. Psychology needed to be broader. That brings us to functionalism. Part 12. The Functionalist Protest. The transition from structuralism to functionalism was strongly influenced by Charles Darwin. Darwin's theory of evolution changed the focus of psychology. Instead of asking only about the structure of consciousness, psychologists began asking about its function. What does the mind do? How does consciousness help organisms adapt? How do mental processes help people survive, learn, solve problems, and navigate their environments? That is the heart of functionalism. Functionalism is concerned with how the mind functions and how it is used by an organism to adapt to its environment. Functionalists asked what mental processes accomplish. They believed the mind should be studied as an accumulation of processes that lead to practical consequences in the real world. This was a deliberate protest against Wundt's experimental psychology and Titchener's structural psychology. Functionalists believed Wundt and Titchener were too restrictive. They could not adequately answer questions about what the mind does and how it does it. Structuralism asked, what is consciousness made of? Functionalism asked, what is consciousness for? That is a powerful shift. Part 13. Why functionalism fit the American zeitgeist. Functionalism fit the American intellectual climate better than structuralism did. American psychology was pragmatic. It wanted useful knowledge. It wanted psychology to address everyday problems: education, work, adaptation, development, mental health, individual differences, social life, practical decision-making. Functionalists were interested in the applications of psychology to real-world problems. They wanted to know how people function in and adapt to their environments. This made functionalism a better fit for American psychology than Titchener's pure structural science. The functionalists were not simply rejecting science, they were expanding what psychology could be scientific about. They said psychology should study mental life in action. Not just its pieces, not just its contents, not just its structure, but its use, its purpose, its adaptive value. That is why Darwin's influence matters so much. Evolution encouraged psychologists to think of mind and behavior as tools for adaptation, and that shift would shape much of American psychology going forward. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. Wundt matters. Titchener matters. Washburn matters. Lucy May. Boring matters. Darwin matters. And the functionalists matter. But the pattern matters more. Each figure or school is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. Wundt built experimental psychology around conscious experience. Titchener narrowed that project into structuralism and tried to map the elements of consciousness. Critics attacked introspection, elementism, artificiality, and the narrowness of structural psychology. Functionalists then shifted the question from structure to purpose. Instead of asking only, "What is the mind made of?" they asked, "What does the mind do?" That question changed the direction of psychology. It moved the field toward adaptation, application, and real-world functioning. And that is exactly how psychology keeps evolving. A theory defines the field, a critic finds the limits. A new question changes the path. That's our episode for today. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never trust a theory that refuses to explain its origin story. This is Dr. Jackal, signing off.